Old man, that tattoo looks fake. Briggs's voice struck the little diner booth like a cold blow. He stood blocking the small table, his large frame casting a shadow over the worn coat of Walter Hayes, 81 years old. Walter didn't respond. He simply stirred his coffee with a slow, deliberate motion, as if the heaviness of the entire morning rested in that silver spoon. Briggs leaned closer, pointing at the blurred ink on the old man's wrinkled forearm, a serpent swallowing its own tail, encircling a five-pointed star. Where'd you get this, some back-alley tattoo shop? Or did it come in a cereal box? Lopez placed a gentle hand on his friend's shoulder. Briggs, stop. But Briggs brushed him off his eyes, carrying the effortless confidence of someone who had never truly been tested. The whole diner went still. Mara froze with a coffee pot in her hand. Regulars fell silent as if a cold draft had swept across every table. Briggs reached out and tapped the tattoo. In that instant, Walter stiffened. A thin fracture, invisible yet unmistakable, passed through his eyes. In a single breath, the diner faded away, replaced by the smell of wet earth and the harsh, desperate breathing of men who once ran beneath the razor's edge of death. Walter lifted his gaze. His voice came out low and rough, yet sharp as a blade dulled by decades of use. It matters. Only to those who truly earned it. Briggs burst into loud laughter, his mocking voice echoing across the room. Earned it. Come on, old man, don't make me laugh. But his laughter was slowly swallowed by a sound rising from the distance, low, heavy, advancing fast, like a warning no one could ignore. A convoy of unfamiliar vehicles was approaching the diner. No one knew power had just shifted directions, and the center of that oncoming storm lay on the trembling forearm of the old man sitting quietly before them. If you believe true courage doesn't lie in gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories to help us preserve the memories, dignity, and honor of our quiet heroes. Walter sat completely still, as though time itself had paused around him. His eyes were fixed on the window, where the gray morning sky stretched across a row of small houses, peaceful, in a way that felt foreign to everything he carried inside. His hand rested lightly on the table, trembling just a bit, not from fear, but from old memories rising quietly like a wind no one could see. In that moment, a fragment of the past flickered through Walter's mind. He heard again the hush of a sealed jungle, the damp earth clinging to every step, the rain hammering the leaves like needles, and the ragged breaths of young soldiers clinging to one another, just to survive in a place with no path home. Young faces smeared with mud from collar to boots, eyes filled with both fear and determination, appeared and dissolved like drifting smoke. Walter's breathing slowed, steady, and grounded like a rope anchoring him above the depths of memory. Every jeer Briggs had thrown at him slipped off, as if landing on a lake already frozen over. No ripples, no reaction, no retaliation. Only a silence so heavy it forced anyone paying attention to realize one truth sometimes. Silence isn't weakness, sometimes it is the strength of a man who has lived through things no one wants to remember. From behind the counter, Mara watched quietly. She had seen Walter chuckle softly at the customers' stories about their kids, seen him carefully count out coins for his usual cup of coffee. But this silence was different. Deeper. Heavier. It tightened her chest with an unease she couldn't explain. Briggs thought otherwise. Arms crossed, he wore his self-satisfaction plainly. In his mind, Walter's silence was nothing more than fear, or the hesitation of a man who knew he had been exposed. He smirked, convinced the old man before him was just a wooden statue frozen because he didn't dare defend whatever lie Briggs believed he'd uncovered. But Lopez, who had been quiet from the start, began to feel a chill crawl down his spine. He had seen many kinds of people, braggarts, hotheads, careless ones. But not this kind of silence. This wasn't surrender. It was waiting. A heavy, unreadable waiting, as if the 81-year-old man was turning back a page inside himself to remember exactly who he was. The air inside the diner thickened heavy enough that everyone seemed to breathe the same compressed weight. The clatter of silverware, the scrape of chairs, the soft hum of conversation, all vanished, swallowed by a stillness that made people look at one another with quiet caution. Walter wasn't looking at Briggs, not at Mara, not at anyone. His gaze stayed on the window, but then, just for a moment, he turned his head. A brief glance, soft and calm, but sharp enough to make Lopez's skin prickle. Not out of anger, not out of challenge, but because there was something deeper, older, stronger in that look than any knife or rifle could ever hold. Lopez leaned slightly to the side as though the soldier's instinct within him whispered that this man was not someone to be underestimated. Briggs noticed none of it. He thought Walter was just avoiding eye contact, too weak to look him in the face, But everyone else in the diner sensed another truth entirely. This silence wasn't ordinary. It was a sign that a door to the past had cracked open, and everyone knows some doors are better left untouched. Walter placed his hand on the edge of the table gently, as if trying to hold on to a little piece of peace for himself. His nostrils flared just slightly, like someone catching a scent he hadn't smelled in years. The damp jungle soil soaked with nameless days, the unspoken promises exchanged under fire, the lingering presence of souls still standing somewhere behind him. Mara looked at him wanting to intervene but helpless. Young soldiers often came into the diner, loud, proud, eager to show their strength through raised voices and tall stances. But the old man before her carried a kind of strength that weighed differently, heavier, quieter, and infinitely more real. It felt as though she was witnessing the silence of someone who had traded a lifetime so others could argue freely in a diner like this. Lopez shot Briggs a quick glance, but Briggs didn't notice. He didn't see the consequences forming inch by inch. He didn't sense the subtle shift in the air. He didn't realize he had touched something he did not understand. By now, the silence wasn't a pause anymore. It had become a warning only the perceptive could hear. And soon that silence would not last much longer. Briggs was about to push everything past a boundary he never even knew existed. Briggs drew in a long breath and raised his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Old man, stop hiding behind that silence. If you want to talk, then step outside. Man to man." The volume made several customers jump. A spoon clattered against a cup and then went completely still. People at nearby tables began whispering. Some shook their heads, others stared down at their plates to avoid witnessing something they knew shouldn't be happening. A wave of embarrassment swept across the small room, not for Walter, but for Briggs, who had no idea he was exposing his own immaturity in front of someone he did not understand at all. Walter remained seated, his hand frozen above his coffee cup. He did not tremble. He did not react. He simply stared into the invisible space stretching between himself and Briggs. But Briggs mistook that quiet for defiance. He stepped closer, curling his fingers in a taunting gesture. "Stand up, old man. Let's settle this outside." No one in the diner wanted this scene to continue, but at every pair of eyes, and then Briggs did the unthinkable. He grabbed Walter's wrist and yanked him forward. Walter's body jerked with the pull, his sleeve sliding up just enough to reveal more of the faded tattoo. The serpent swallowing its tail. The 5-pointed star. A silent emblem no one in the diner recognized except Walter and the men who had once sworn never to speak of it again. In a single breath, the past bit into him again. A flash of memory shot through his mind, the raw smell of mud, bullets tearing through the air, a bloody hand gripping his arm, a 5-pointed star glowing under a moon that never appeared on any map. Young faces darkened by exhaustion, refusing to fall, a vow that had never been spoken aloud. Then the brutal jungle vanished, replaced once more by the warm scent of burnt coffee. Behind the counter, Mara clutched her old phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She trembled with anger and fear, anger at the disrespect toward a man who had never shown anything but gentleness, because something beneath Walter's calm felt like a massive door creaking open, behind which lived things that should never be disturbed. "Let him go, Briggs," Lopez said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of a warning. Briggs snapped back. "You think I'm scared? Look at this tattoo. It's a cheap joke." And Briggs reached out and touched the tattoo again. A casual tap, yet a mistake so severe it could never be undone. The moment his fingertip met the toughened skin worn by decades, Walter's heartbeat shifted. Not faster, not slower, just sharper, colder, deeper, like the echo of old footsteps returning from a place no one wished to revisit. Walter lifted his eyes. The tired stillness of an old man was gone. What replaced it was the gaze of someone who knew exactly what was coming and had survived things Briggs wasn't yet old enough to imagine. Briggs froze for half a second, but his youthful ego smothered every instinct telling him to stop. He scoffed, trying harder than ever to look fearless. "What's with that look, old man? I'm just getting started." But Lopez didn't laugh. He caught a glimpse of something in Walter's eyes, something almost impossible to describe. A sharpness, like tempered steel, but not born from anger. It felt more like sorrow, from someone who had seen too much, carried too much, and was now being dragged back into shadows he had buried for half a lifetime. The air in the diner thickened. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. A heavy silence fell over everything, as if the entire room sensed they stood on a fragile boundary that Briggs in his recklessness was about to shatter. Walter remained upright, but every line on his face tightened. Not in rage, not in fear, but with the quiet focus of a man who once had to choose between life and death before he was even old enough to understand the full weight of those words. Briggs saw nothing. Lopez saw everything, and Mara saw enough to know danger was rising with every passing second. And then the force that broke the balance came not from Walter, not from Briggs, not from anyone standing in the diner. It came from the faint vibration in the small kitchen behind them, where a phone had just been lifted, and a few quiet words were about to change the fate of every person in that room. In the cramped kitchen behind the diner, Mara closed the door so softly it barely made a sound. Her hands trembled as she dialed the familiar number of the sister-like friend who worked at the command office on base. She lifted the phone to her ear and swallowed hard. "Stacy, it's me. 2 soldiers are harassing an old man, and his tattoo. It's a serpent swallowing its tail inside a circle." The other end of the line went silent. Not the silence of bad reception, but the silence of someone whose breath had stopped, as if Stacy had just heard something she didn't dare believe. Mara felt her heart slam against her ribs, her eyes beginning to sting with worry. "Mara, say it again." "Exactly, what does that tattoo look like?" Stacy's voice dropped, stretched thin like a wire pulled to its limit. Mara repeated every detail, every faded line on Walter's aged forearm. And the moment she finished, she heard a chair scrape violently across the floor on the other end. At headquarters, Senior Specialist Stacy Miller shot to her feet. She glanced around the room, her face half drained of color from fear and half from the knowledge that a single description like this was enough to shake the entire chain of command. Stacy rushed into the adjacent office where a high-ranking officer was reviewing documents. "Sir, we have a possible Omega mark." The papers in his hand dropped onto the desk. No questions. No hesitation. Only one cold, decisive order. "Notify the General. Now." In the base's large conference room, General Alden Cross, commander of all Special Operations Forces, was in the middle of a meeting with his component leaders. The thick report in front of him held plans for the most sensitive operations of the coming week. But none of it mattered when the duty officer leaned in and whispered 2 words into his ear. Omega mark. General Cross's face changed instantly, like a sheet of steel heated to white, and then plunged into ice within a heartbeat. He pushed his chair back and rose to his full height. "This meeting is over. Get my vehicles. Now." No one in the room dared to question him. No one asked why. Those who had served under Cross long enough knew there are certain code names never spoken unless they truly surface. And when they do, everything else becomes secondary. Minutes later, 3 government-plated SUVs shot out of the motor pool with a speed no one on base would ever interfere with. The gate guards recognized the signal instantly and opened the way. The weight of the convoy wasn't from the engines, but from the man riding inside the man who carried the exact same ink Walter bore. Back at the diner, Briggs still had no idea his fate was hurtling toward him on the rails of his own arrogance. He stood in the middle of the room with arms crossed, indifferent, as if he had merely scolded an old man. Lopez, however, felt it before anyone else. He sensed the shift in the air long before the sound reached their ears. Something was coming. Something that didn't belong in an ordinary morning. A pressure heavy deep hung in the space around them like the whole room was bracing for a single touch to shatter everything. Then the deep rumble reached the diner. Tires screeching on pavement. Car doors slamming open in unison. Customers near the windows jumped to their feet. Their breath caught in their throats. Briggs turned around, irritated. What now? But when he saw the men stepping out of the vehicles, uniforms, immaculate shoes, polished to a mere shine. Briggs froze. They weren't military police. They weren't gate guards. They weren't ordinary officers. They were the personal security detail of General Alden Cross, the very people even elite units stood at attention for when they entered a room. Lopez stood perfectly still, feeling as if the last taut string inside him had just snapped. He understood then that this had gone far, far beyond a diner argument. Behind the counter, Mara's hands still trembled, but hope flickered in her eyes. She whispered, barely audible, "Walter, we'll be safe now." Briggs swallowed hard. His eyes widened when he recognized the insignia on the lead soldier's shoulder. In that instant, every trace of arrogance evaporated like steam. Then the diner door opened, and no one in the room felt like they were standing in the same world anymore. A silent authority swept in, pushing aside all the chaos that had filled the room moments earlier. And at that exact moment, the arrival of the man who commanded the nation's most elite warriors was about to overturn everything inside that tiny diner. The diner door opened, and General Alden Cross stepped inside with the straight-backed posture forged by 4 decades of military discipline. The moment he entered, his eyes swept directly toward the man sitting quietly at the last booth where Walter Hayes still held his cup of cold coffee. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He didn't spare Briggs or Lopez a glance. General Cross looked only at Walter, as if the entire room contained just one person he had come to see. Briggs, whose hand was still near Walter's arm, jerked it back as if burned. His whole body tensed on instinct. He didn't understand what was happening, but one truth cut cleanly through his mind. Anyone who could make a 4-star general walk into a room with eyes like that could not possibly be just an old man. General Cross stopped in front of Walter's table. He straightened his broad shoulders, bearing the weight of decades of battlefields, then raised his right hand to his brow. A perfectly sharp regulation salute, precise, reverent, unmistakable. The diner fell dead silent. No one could breathe. No one had ever seen such a thing, a 4-star special operations general commander of tens of thousands saluting a silver-haired old man in a roadside diner. Walter slowly set his coffee cup down. He lifted his head, his tired eyes warming with a faint glow only those who have survived the same storm can truly recognize. He smiled a small, gentle smile like a parenthesis at the end of a long story. "Alden, you've gotten old." General Cross exhaled softly. For a moment, he was no longer the formidable general who had just walked in. He was simply a man meeting a piece of his past, a past he thought had been buried under the dust of forgotten battlefields. "Walter, I'm grateful to still see you sitting here." Briggs began to shake. He made no effort to hide it anymore. His legs stepped backward once then again, as if the distance between himself and Walter could somehow ease the fear rising inside him. Lopez lowered his head. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Respect for something he couldn't yet name, but his heart already knew was real. General Cross turned to the 2 young soldiers. His eyes went cold again, sharp as a honed blade. "You?" questioned this man. Briggs opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat felt as dry as sand. Lopez stood frozen hands clasped behind his back out of habit when facing a superior officer. No one answered. No one dared. The silence between them grew so heavy, a single breath could have shattered it. But Cross didn't need them to speak. He had already read everything he needed in Briggs's panicked eyes and Lopez's remorseful posture. Walter, in contrast, sat a little straighter. He looked from Briggs to Lopez, then up at Cross with the gaze of a man who understood that the story about to be told was one he had carried for half a century. The diners didn't understand what was happening, but they knew they were witnessing something a person might see only once in a lifetime. General Cross drew in a deep breath, turned toward Walter, then looked down at the faint tattoo visible on the old man's arm. A history older than Briggs's entire life stood right there in front of them. And in that moment, everyone felt that the truth no longer lay in words, but under the sleeve about to be rolled up, where the history of an entire generation of warriors waited to be revealed. General Alden Cross stood silently before Walter, then slowly reached for his own cuff. No one dared breathe. No one dared blink as he began rolling up his sleeve fold by deliberate fold. The slow movement carried the weight of half a century of history of oaths spoken only among men who were no longer alive to repeat them. And then everyone saw it. A tattoo emerged on the 4-star general's solid forearm, a serpent swallowing its tail, forming a circle with a 5-pointed star inside. Bolder, sharper, clearer, but unmistakably identical to the faded ink on Walter's arm. The entire diner seemed to tilt. A few people dropped their spoons. Someone covered their mouth in disbelief. No one fully understood the meaning of the symbol, but everyone knew this much: no general would bear the same tattoo as an ordinary old man unless it was tied to a truth they were never allowed to speak of. Briggs staggered back another step, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Lopez swallowed hard, his spine straightening instinctively as he confronted something he never imagined he'd witness in a modest roadside diner. General Cross looked directly at Briggs and Lopez, then back at Walter. His voice was not loud, but clear and deep enough to strike the hearts of everyone present. "Do you two have any idea who you just insulted?" No one answered. No one dared. Cross lowered his gaze to the tattoo on his own arm, as if seeing the shadows of the past rise again. In 1968, he began in a place our maps did not acknowledge. A team of 5 men was sent to accomplish something nearly impossible. The mission was so classified that our names never appeared in any record. He paused, his breath heavy, carrying the weight of jungle depths and the blood of those who never returned. When we were ambushed, I was the first one hit. The bullet tore through my shoulder. I was losing blood so fast I couldn't stand. But Walter... Cross turned fully toward the silver-haired old man. He carried me through the jungle for 2 days, through mud, through rivers, through enemy patrols that searched every inch of ground. If not for him, I would not be standing here speaking to you today. No one in the diner moved. Even Briggs, who had shouted the loudest, now stood as though all the air had been pulled from his lungs. Cross continued, his voice growing heavier. There were 5 men who bore this tattoo. 5 who survived a moment no one believed possible. And only 2 are alive today. He lifted his hand, pointing to his own tattoo, then to Walter's. Those 2 are standing right in front of you. The declaration struck the tiny diner like a bolt of lightning. No one would ever look at Walter as a regular old man again. Briggs's knees weakened. He whispered, disoriented, like someone whose world had just collapsed. My God. I didn't know. Cross didn't let him finish. His voice turned cold, so cold it forced Briggs to retreat another step. Tomorrow, both of you report to my office. Bring all of your credentials. Be prepared to surrender everything. Lopez shut his eyes. Briggs simply crumpled inside, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The diner sank into a silence filled not with fear, but with reverence. A reverence for a truth Americans too often forget. Some heroes live entire lifetimes without ever speaking of what they did for the world. Walter exhaled slowly. In that breath lived 50 years of fatigue and the weight of everything he chose to keep silent, so that the generations after him could live untouched by the darkness he endured. No one said another word. No one in the room dared disturb the moment when the truth was finally pulled from the depths of long-buried military secrets. But before punishment could be issued, and before Briggs or Lopez could say another thing, Walter himself was the one preparing to step forward and do the last thing anyone expected. He did not want revenge. He wanted to teach them the lesson that war had taught him. The air in the diner was still heavy as stone, but Walter was the first to break the silence. He placed both hands on the edge of the table and pushed himself up with the slightest bit of force. His posture was slightly bent with age, but his eyes were bright and steady like those of the young soldier who once walked into the jungle not knowing whether he would ever walk out again. Briggs, Lopez, come here. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly to both young soldiers. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a reprimand. It was simply a call so gentle that the listener's heart had to translate its meaning. Briggs stepped forward hesitantly, each footfall feeling like a heavy stone dropping into his chest. Lopez followed behind, head lowered, trying to steady the breath that trembled with emotion. When they stood before him, Walter looked at them for a long, long moment. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the gaze of a man who had seen too much life and too much death to waste a single breath on fury. Finally, he lifted a hand and touched the tattoo on his own arm. His voice was slow, deliberate. This tattoo doesn't make a man. It's the man who gives it meaning. Briggs swallowed, unable to take his eyes off that old, weathered hand. Walter turned his gaze toward him, not to chastise, not to frighten, but as if he could see straight through the facade of arrogance to the life struggling behind it. Briggs, there's only one thing you truly own in this life. Not your skills, not your rank, not your unit's reputation. It's your character. That is the one thing no one can take from you unless you throw it away yourself. Don't lose it. Briggs turned his face aside. He didn't want anyone to see the mixture of shame and confusion burning in his eyes. Lopez stood motionless, but his chest rose and fell sharply. His eyes reddened. He didn't try to hide it anymore. Deep inside, the shame he felt now was no longer fear of punishment, but the pain of realizing he had disrespected a man he should have saluted. Walter looked at them the way a man looks after losing friends carrying wounded brothers on his back and keeping promises whispered in places where no one else could hear. He drew in a soft breath, and one final flashback flickered through his mind. A dim fire in the jungle. A young face beside him whispering, never quit, a blood-soaked hand gripping his own. A vow never spoken aloud, yet remembered for a lifetime. General Cross stepped close to Walter and placed a strong but gentle hand on his shoulder, exactly where Walter had once placed his hand on the blood-covered lieutenant, pulling him through the forest of death. Walter, Cross said quietly, his voice thick with gratitude. Walter smiled, shaking his head as if to say no thanks were necessary. Because what he had done back then wasn't for glory. It was for something all true soldiers understand. Saving one life means saving a family, saving a future, saving hope for people who will never know their names. The entire diner remained silent. No one knew what to say. No one dared interrupt the moment in which an old soldier passed on his final lesson, a lesson not born from medals or victories, but from pain, memory, and compassion, carried through a lifetime. Walter exhaled softly, as if placing the final period on his teaching. Not long-winded, not preachy, but enough for the two young soldiers to carry it for the rest of their lives. And as Briggs and Lopez stepped away, heavy-hearted, but forever changed everyone in the diner, understood that Walter's story did not end on this morning. It had become the foundation for a new generation of warriors, men who would learn when to bow their heads, when to stand tall, and how to respect the footsteps of those who had walked half a century before them. After that fateful morning in the small diner, General Alden Cross returned to headquarters with a resolve so clear that every officer in the command staff saw it in his eyes. Just a few weeks later, a new announcement was issued. The Legacy Program, the first mandatory curriculum in the history of special operations, where every candidate and young officer would learn about the nameless units, the unwritten missions, and the men who never stood in front of a camera, but formed the foundation of everything they now inherited. Not taught by active duty officers, not built on theoretical textbooks, but by old veterans, men who carried in their eyes the weight of jungle's gunfire and a silence that had lasted half a lifetime. And at the top of the support roster stood two names, Briggs and Lopez. They were not expelled from the military. They were not stripped of rank. They were handed something far more difficult: to serve the very men they had once disrespected, arranging classrooms, carrying materials, preparing lecture halls, greeting each veteran with a bow born from genuine respect. On the first day of the program, Briggs stood at the doorway of a classroom, adjusting the nameplate for an elderly veteran. His hands no longer trembled out of fear like they had in that diner. They trembled because of responsibility, because he knew that the presence of men like Walter Hayes was an honor greater than any medal. Lopez quietly helped an old man with a cane step up to the podium. He didn't say much, but the light in his eyes, clear and sincere, said everything for him he had changed. Time passed. A full year. On an early summer afternoon, Briggs walked into a nearby hardware store. The scent of machine oil and fresh-cut wood pulled him back to that diner, to the sound of his own shaking voice, to the tired old eyes he had once misjudged so recklessly. And then he saw Walter standing at the end of the aisle examining an old drill. No General Cross, no security detail, no aura of authority, just a simple old man among the ordinary tools of everyday life. Briggs approached him, his steps slow and steady, as if reminding himself that apologies should never be rushed. "Mr. Hayes," Briggs said softly but clearly, I want to apologize. What I did that day was unforgivable." Walter looked at him for a long moment, as though seeing again the young soldier who had once trembled in fear of a truth he had touched by accident. In that gaze now there was no anger, only understanding. Understanding from a man who knew what it meant to stumble and what it meant to rise again. Finally, Walter extended his hand. His grip was still strong, warm, and genuine, just as it had been when he placed it on Briggs's shoulder in the silent, stunned diner. "Keep learning, Briggs. That's how a man grows." Just one sentence, but enough for Briggs to draw a deep breath and feel something unknotted inside him. As Briggs turned to leave, Walter gently pulled up his sleeve to look once more at the faded ink. The Omega tattoo, a symbol of those who were gone, of the vow to never quit, of a loyalty that outlived wars, fame, and time itself. It was more than a memory. It was a living legacy. A reminder that quiet heroes still walk among us every day, not needing to be seen, not needing to be praised, as long as the next generation understands the value of their sacrifice. Briggs paused at the doorway, looking back at the 81-year-old man quietly inspecting a small bolt. And he knew if he could become even a fraction of what Walter was, his life would not be wasted. And so Walter's story, once just a fleeting moment in a small diner, became the foundation for a new generation. A generation that would learn when to bow their heads before unspoken sacrifices, when to stand tall when the honor of those who came before them needed protection, service, honor stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story reminds you that honor and kindness never retire, please like, share this video, and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.